Well, greetings everybody. My name is JStewart and I'm excited to be teaching this class in international criminal law. So today we have the first of our lectures about what is international criminal law. And what I'm going to do at the beginning of each of these lectures is I'm going to go through a PowerPoint with you, and I can structure things such that I can keep myself on part of the screen for a while and the PowerPoint's just beside me, and then at certain junctures we will just have the PowerPoint, and at others I can just zoom on me, which I'll do more when I'm telling stories. I think I mentioned in the first discussion that we had together on Zoom that I've been teaching for a good many years now, and what I've learned is that students most appreciate the storytelling. So I'm increasingly trying to structure most of my teaching around telling stories from practice and from research, having worked in this field for a couple of decades now, both as a practitioner and as a scholar. So our first discussion together today is about what is international criminal justice. In a way, that's a strange sort of question, but I hope what emerges for you is that it's a relatively amorphous beast, and there are different ways in which we can think about it, which define what its function is. So if we come to the PowerPoint briefly, I'm going to each of our lectures begin with a set of objectives that I want you to take away from the class together. And by the class, I mean both the lecture that I'm giving now for an hour and also the discussion that we'll have in person via Zoom immediately afterwards. And so in this particular instance, here are the objectives that I hope you would take away from our class. First, I really want you to have a working understanding of what international criminal law is. As I say, it's not obvious, and there are different assumptions that we need to make as we answer that question, assumptions that will be helpful to you as you think about what the functions of the discipline are. Equally importantly, it's crucial that you appreciate the definition is quite imprecise. There are broader and narrower ways of understanding the field, and this becomes fairly crucial as we emerge throughout the course, because I want you to have a keen sense of what it is that we're talking about at any given moment. And so to have this appreciation, I think, is really quite crucial from the outset. We will be drawing on it time and time again throughout our time together. Relatedly, it's important that you are able to identify international criminal law's objectives. Why do we have it? What was it trying to do? And that's keenly related to our question about what is international criminal law, because what we'll see is it's relatively amorphous and includes more or less different sorts of things, but also we will see that the objectives of international criminal law are numerous, controversial, sometimes in tension, and unresolved. Unresolved in the sense that there's no real sort of agreed concept of what international criminal law should be doing and what the hierarchy is of purposes that it could assign to itself. So we'll say more about that. I also wanted to ask the question, what is international criminal law from a very legal perspective? By which I mean, where do the norms come from? Where is it that we get international criminal law? And so in that context, I want you to emerge at the end of this class with an understanding of how international criminal law is a kind of legal hybrid that draws on numerous other fields of law, like international human rights law, like international humanitarian law, like national law, especially national criminal law. And so I want you to see all of these different legal influences being absorbed into international law, creating a sort of a hybrid which is in some senses a very strange beast. So that's an overview. As I say, I'm going to try and illustrate this based on two sets of readings that I have assigned for you today. I think the reading is a little bit more voluminous today than it will be for the remainder of the course. But in a way, I thought the reading set the scene for a series of discussions that we will have, and really would lay a bedrock for a number of different discussions. The first readings I assigned for today were a set of lectures I gave at the Collège de France in June last year. That's a set of 4 lectures about the history of international criminal justice, and to some extent it may have been meaningful to include them later in our time together when we do discuss history directly. But I thought what might be interesting is to give them to you at the very outset, such that you have a sort of an orientation of international criminal law as a field, from the First World War all the way up until the International Criminal Court. There are various things we can say and draw upon, but there are also a set of stories in that series of lectures that I can tease out to illustrate points. So I hope you have a chance to go through those. And then in terms of the subsequent reading that I wanted to share with you, I wanted to introduce you first to this concept of reading groups, which I use intermittently within the syllabus. Reading groups are a way of me not deciding what is the most important article for the class to read, and in attempting to bring in an eclectic mix of perspectives that we can use in an exchange of ideas together. All of the reading that I'm assigning to you within these reading groups is really important. And it's really important for a number of different reasons. So the first piece that Group A was going to read for this particular class is a very famous piece written in 1950 by George Schwarzenberg, called The Problem of International Criminal Law. And in essence, that article is saying, listen, we really don't have the political prerequisites to insert a body of criminal law into the international legal order. We don't have the prerequisites on a number of different levels. One of which would be a sort of a strong sense of world government with a police force that actually goes out to arrest individuals who have committed international crimes, such that this system can operate in a fair and equal, objective, uniform sense. Instead, what we've done is we've created a system where we purport to have all of those phenomena. We purport to have objectivity, and we purport to have a fair system based on principle, but we insert it into a world that is radically unequal in terms of power and influence. And when we bring those two things together, says Schwarzenberg, it doesn't work as promised. It can't work as promised. The problem of international criminal law is the sort of political structures that would make all of these promises about justice meaningful don't exist in the world. And so there's an inherent problem. If you have watched my my Collège de France lectures, I sort of try and posit that as the political instrumentalization of international criminal law. And I hold it up at the beginning of our time together as the political problem in international criminal law, which is enormous. It is one of the key ways of thinking of and of understanding international criminal law. The other one that I want to introduce to you, though, as a sort of an orientation as we go through, and which is sort of the the alternative key pole that I used to describe the history of international criminal justice in the lectures series that I hope you had a chance to read is moral outrage. And so if I can essentialize what moral outrage means, and I think it's helpful to be introduced to it now, it's actually relatively easy to simulate for you. And the best way, well, there are many different ways of simulating it for you in this field, and some of the stories I think I will tell you will do that. But in keeping with the lectures I gave in Paris, the best way to simulate it for you is to invite you to read the first 4 pages of the medical case at Nuremberg. Because the first 4 pages of the medical case in Nuremberg detail a set of experiments that Nazis performed on concentration camp inmates that are spectacularly sadistic and brutal. And the experience of reading about these experiments is, I think, for everyone, shocking. It's a shocking experience. And it's disgusting. And it's revolting, literally. And so in reading those, you can sort of emulate for yourself the feelings that have propelled international criminal justice for a long time. Now, what you've got to, I want to intensify and then diminish that feeling for you in 2 different steps. So first, what you should do is you should read after this the allegations in the medical case at Nuremberg, and observe how you feel about it. Then, after you've observed how you feel about it, understand that the chief architect of those experiments, someone called Dr. Joseph Mengele, lived out his days first in Argentina and then in Brazil, and died of natural causes in old age, swimming happily on the beach. And I tell this story because what I'm hoping you can at least access, if not agree with, but certainly access, is a sense, no, that's not right. That guy committed like unspeakably brutal experiments on human beings. He shouldn't get away with it. No, I don't want to live in a world where he gets away with it. And so you have this problem of international criminal justice as being a problem that is a dialogue between those 2 political and moral positions. The political problem is, listen, who's pretending that Russia and the United States are going to be held accountable for international crimes? It's clearly biased, the system. And another dialogue which is this, yeah, that's true, but if you can prosecute someone like Mengele, then do it. Oh, but it's political. Yeah, I don't care. Prosecute him. Oh, yeah, but it's instrumentalized, and other people who do this sort of thing get away with it. Yeah, I don't care. It's too bad. It's too bad what he did, and if you can catch him and prosecute him, do it. And that is in a nutshell the sort of moral political problem of international criminal justice. And I think it's helpful to be introduced to it in the beginning, because it sort of defines different poles of thinking about the field. One pole from a sort of more political instrumental approach is, listen, this is so clearly biased. It's never been anything other than biased. And therefore it's part of the problem. It replicates power structures. It's in its most recent manifestations at the International Criminal Court, it's racist in that it only really has ever prosecuted Africans. It's part of the problem. We should do away with it. The politics triumphs over the moral. And then another group of people who acknowledge all of those sorts of criticisms and concerns, but believe that there's some degree of redemption in the fact that it is prosecuting people who have done spectacularly brutal things to other people. And while we should certainly do our very best to focus on redeeming the political stain of selectivity, we are still prosecuting people who have done unbelievably brutal things. And I intend to be a little bit careful in sharing with you the details of those brutal things, but I wanted to give you at the outset a sense of the emotion, the moral outrage that has propelled the field in the face of obvious political instrumentalization and bias that we will discuss. So voila, that's a little bit Schwarzenberg in the first piece. The second piece that I invited you to read is also very famous by someone called Mian Damashka. And the Damashka piece is very important too, because it speaks about the multiple different purposes that we could have for international criminal justice. What's the function of this? Why would we do this? And there are various ideas about that, and I'll talk to you more about them in just a moment as we go through the PowerPoint. But they range from sort of like, well, international criminal justice should exist in order to write history, and that is to prevent against denial. There's a nice saying which I think is universally true from the places that I've worked. Denial is the final stage of a genocide. And by denial, we can talk about all of the structures that are put in place in a society such that, people don't have to face the reality of a history of genocide. And we see that in colonial countries like Canada, Australia, and a number of other places also. So maybe part of the role of international criminal justice is to be oppositional to those elements of denial. And in that sense, it has a function which is born of a desire for history writing. Or maybe it's just retribution. Maybe it's just punishing people like Mengele because he deserves it. And because, in some sense, it restores a sense of justice to the world. Or maybe it's deterrence. Maybe what we're really concerned about is, listen, never again. The slogan that my parents' generation propagated, or perhaps my grandparents' generation propagated after the Second World War, which is like, listen, that was insane. And so, like, whatever we were thinking about ourselves and our societies and the world previously, like, forget that, right? We need to take a big leap forward here. And above everything else, never again. And so maybe international criminal justice has a role in ensuring that proposition, in deterring people from doing what Mengele did, out of some promise, vague promise, that if you do that, someone somewhere is going to hunt you down for the rest of your life and put you on trial. And then there'll be the political instrumentalists whose opinions I sometimes share, saying, listen, that's a waste of resources. There are way better things you could spend your time doing than chasing Mengele. There are way more injustices in the world than just those inscribed by Mengele and his cohorts, and we can talk about those momentarily. I'll say more about the different purposes of international criminal justice, but Damashka's piece is an important introduction to them. The final piece by Darrell Robinson is an important piece about the origins of the law that is used in international criminal justice. And he posits the existence of an identity crisis where we're really not clear we're really not clear what the legal function is. Are we an international court applying international rules of interpretation with a sort of an international law sensibility to what we're doing? Or are we a criminal court and within the criminal law context really trying to protect defendants against the power of the state, which is kind of a traditional function of the criminal law, right? I mean, prior to the criminal law, the king, the queen just did whatever she wanted, off with his head. And the criminal law acted as a restraint on the power of the sovereign, right? So is that the ethos that we want to have? Or do we have more of a human rights orientation for international criminal law? In a way, the international criminal law that we see since the end of the Cold War really is a triumph of the human rights movement. And the human rights movement claims it as its own. Like in this long period, imagine it, in this long period between the end of the Cold War and the development of the Yugoslav Tribunal in 1993-4, there's almost nothing. There's like the Eichmann trial, who was Mengele's partner. They fled together to Argentina. They've got Eichmann, but not Mengele. Almost nothing. And yet, like, a spectacular number of atrocities over that period. And so, the human rights movement was like, listen, international criminal justice was the one thing that really had important real consequences. Like, human rights are all well and good. And it's like, oh, yeah, the right to life and, the right not to be tortured. But, like, governments don't seem all that concerned about complying. And so the human rights movement was what really pushed for the International Criminal Court. We'll hear more about the history of that institution and how people had been trying to create it for 150 years. But maybe the expectation in sort of thinking about where the law comes from in international criminal law is, well, it should be defined from a very human rights type orientation. That's what its origins are. And the coming together of all of these influences creates sort of a weird phenomenon. I want to tell you a story about that. So many moons ago, I worked for the Yugoslav Tribunal as an appellate prosecutor in the Office of the Prosecutor. And there were very many interesting experiences about it. But one of the things that was especially interesting was the way in which it's sort of the Star Trek phenomenon, where you turn up to work and your boss is Chinese and your colleague on the same case is from Tajikistan, and that the other prosecutor on a case that was very similar, who understands the law well, is from Malawi, and so on and so forth. And it's quickly a very intense experience in comparative law and comparative criminal law. And you sort of realize how legal education is an indoctrination, sometimes facilitative, sometimes not, in a particular way of thinking about law and responsibility and ethics and things of this sort. So, we're discussing, we have a team meeting around one mode of liability. We'll discuss modes of liability down the road, but they're essentially the devices like superior responsibility, aiding and abetting responsibility, and things like that. And a German colleague suddenly stands up and bangs his fist on the desk and yells, "I won't be party to a trial that violates the principle of culpability," and walks out. And it was a strange experience for me. It was like, I don't even know what that is, let alone whether we're violating it. I've never heard about it. I'll say more about what the principle is. But to highlight for you within the context of an initial discussion about what is international criminal justice, to highlight that it's the amalgamation of a whole series of different comparative ideas of law that are infused into the body and practice of international criminal law by the fact that it draws on people from all of these different traditions. And sometimes within that process, there are important ways in which we just don't even understand what language we're talking because of the differences in law. I can say more about that momentarily. Let me come back to the PowerPoint. And so the first thing that I wanted to do is give you an overview of the reading, but then start to talk about the definition of international criminal law itself. And so what I have on the screen here is a sort of a working definition. And after giving you this working definition, what I want to do is to sort of problematize each aspect of it, to highlight for you what the key elements of it are, but then to suggest that in some aspects, all of the elements could be criticized as being arbitrary. So here is the definition. International criminal law includes the crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggression, as defined in international law. The field encompasses all criminal law processes that involve the enforcement of these crimes. So keep that in mind briefly, and I want to go through several critiques which try to push at some of these ideas. So the first critique is that using the crimes as a definition of international criminal law is arbitrary. So the first of my examples there is a case where international crimes were prosecuted. And so the first case is called Van Anrat. Van Anrat was a Dutch businessman who sold chemicals to Saddam Hussein. Those chemicals were used to gas Iraqi Kurds in the south of Iraq, and many people died as a consequence. It's an amazing case, Van Anrat, for all sorts of reasons. The prosecutors are quite close friends of mine, and I'm interested in the relationship between commerce and atrocity, so I know quite a lot about that particular case. I'll tell you a story about it. So Van Anrat is this Dutch businessman, and he meets up with Saddam Hussein at a moment where Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq is under sanctions, and you can't sell it any things which contribute to Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction program, including gas, mustard gas. And at this moment, this Dutch businessman meets with Hussein and makes a deal to provide for him several tankers worth of a precursor that's used for mustard gas. Now, the thing about the precursor is that it can be used for other things too. And so imagine from a prosecutorial perspective, you're trying to say Van Anrat is responsible for the genocide because, well, we'll come to genocide, but it is a genocide because the Iraqi Kurds are an ethnic group and use of the weapon is intended to kill them. You're trying to say that this guy Van Anrat, this Dutch businessman, is responsible for genocide for selling a product that has multiple uses. So, that's potentially sweeping concept of responsibility. And what are the ramifications of extrapolating that precedent across, I don't know, the global trade in weaponry? Especially during the Cold War, which was only cold for a very small number of countries. It was actually hot for the vast majority of the world because superpowers funneled weapons to all sorts of brutal regimes throughout the world based on ideological commitment, not based on their human rights compliance. So it's a pretty significant case, and it's pretty significant ideas that we're discussing here. And if you want, it's nice in this course, I think, to start thinking about what I describe as the onion factor, which is trying to draw linkages between different elements of what we discuss. And the onion as a metaphor is that each layer that you unpeel of the onion, you get to sort of like inform your thinking by all of the connections that we're making. And so already, if you want to think about the Schwarzenberger piece, Van Anrat is a case that is prosecuted by Dutch courts. And he's charged with war crimes and genocide. So they are international crimes. But maybe the connection that you want to say is that, oh, Professor Stewart, you've made this huge inferential leap that, maybe international criminal law can have some role in governing superpowers during the Cold War, but that's ridiculous. That assumes a degree of political organization in the world that we quite simply don't have. And it serves no purpose to posit that possibility. In fact, it acts as a sort of an apology for the ways in which international criminal justice will be unequally enforced. And then another group of people say, listen, first, and Van Anrat deserved to be prosecuted because he knew, and there was evidence led, that the only possible use of chemicals in that quantity was for chemical weapons. He knew that Saddam Hussein had used them in the past to gas people, and his weapons were used for that. His merchandise was used for that purpose. So he deserved it. It sent an important message globally. It created a set of legal constructs that we could use to resist repetition of the sorts of practices that we saw during the Cold War on the part of superpowers. No matter that the chances of them being prosecuted are relatively marginal, it's still rhetorically powerful, and voila. I'm trying to give you a sort of like an orientation around the field. Van Anrat is a very interesting case because it's based on international crimes, that is genocide and war crimes. It's prosecuted in national courts. And so in a way, this does fall within our definition that I gave you just a moment ago of what is international criminal law. And that definition, again, was it was a genocide and war crimes, and the field encompasses all criminal law processes that involve the enforcement of these crimes. Although it wasn't an international court that enforced it, it was a local court in the Netherlands. This is part and parcel of international criminal law because it's just any mechanism of enforcing crimes that are enumerated in the list above. But I'm going to tell you another story, and that's a story about a case that took place in Washington, D.C. It was a case that a research assistant and I sat all of the way through, in part because I was very interested in the relationship between commerce and atrocity, but also because the case did not neatly fit within the definition of international criminal law, even though it could. So the backgrounds to the Blackwater case were that in 2007, a series of private military commanders who were working for the private military company Blackwater shot up a square in Baghdad. And, the evidence was pretty harrowing about, firing grenade launchers into a packed traffic jam. a large number of people were killed, many more were injured. Grenades were fired into a girls' school that was neighboring. They had a blast radius of 100 meters, so and it was a gridlock traffic jam. There was a Blackwater helicopter flying above and circling around the incident. Said they saw no incoming fire at all. And what was so amazing about the case is it was all dependent on 4 of the Blackwater guards being whistleblowers. So 4 of them in this team that went out came back to their base, and one of them was crying and said to their commander, the rest of our team members just participated in a massacre. And these whistleblowers paid they were fired immediately. They were, their lives were threatened, but they totally stood by it the whole way and pushed for accountability, and testified against their previous team members. What an amazing moral commitment that how many people make that commitment in life, right? Amazing. We can tease it out more if you like. In a way, it's the people who make that moral commitment that make all the atrocities so much harder to bear, because in the people who make those sorts of moral commitments, you see human agency and you see the ability to make moral choices in extreme circumstances. And therefore, all of the people like Mengele who are making like these sadistic choices are exposed as such. Anyway, the significance of the Blackwater trial is that there's no international law anywhere in the trial. It's prosecuted based on American federal law. But to say that there's an important normative distinction between the Blackwater trial and the Van Anrat trial is a little bit bizarre. They both took place in Iraq. They both involved foreigners being party to the killing of Iraqis. They both could have been described as war crimes. And so, in a way, you start to see that by focusing in our definition just on the connection with genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggression, you're sort of making an arbitrary connection with just what individuals are charged with, not about some underlying notion of the criminality, that it was in war, that it was transnational in dimension, which international criminal law doesn't need to be. But you start to see how there are various ways in which just a fixation on the definition of crimes is a little arbitrary. And why limit it to just those offenses? I mean, the origins of international criminal law in a way are in piracy, and other offenses like terrorism or drug offenses, they also have a sort of a strong transnational element to them. So maybe by thinking about international criminal law, we should just be thinking more about the international aspect of that definition, not being so fixated on genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, aggression. That's sort of a weird deference to historicism, the ways in which these crimes developed historically, and less of an emphasis on their function and purpose, or the geography of these sorts of crimes. What's also interesting as a criticism of the definition I just showed you is that international criminal law is not consistent from one forum to the next. And it's important for you to understand this. There are various reasons why this is the case. But what takes place in international criminal law often is that there is an international treaty defining a particular concept. So war crimes, for instance, are defined in the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocols thereafter. And war crimes really borrow very heavily from international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law being Geneva Conventions, additional protocols, Hague Regulations, 1907. This is the body of law that represents, that purports to govern conduct of warring factions in an armed violence. And what it's important for you to understand about international humanitarian law is that the vast majority of it doesn't envisage criminal offending. So if you take just the Geneva Conventions of 1949, there are about 660 provisions, some of which say things like prisoners of war get soap. Now, if prisoners of war don't get soap, it's not a crime. It's just a violation of the public international law obligations of whichever states have signed the Geneva Conventions. But of the 660 provisions in the Geneva Conventions, some are designated crimes, some especially serious ones, about 20. And those are considered war crimes. But what's pretty interesting is that in the conventions themselves, there's very, very rudimentary articulation of what those war crimes are. I think it's fair to say that the Geneva Conventions themselves gesture at what the content of those war crimes are. And the idea is, well, states, you should go away and define them for yourselves in your own legislation. Make them crimes within your national criminal system and put flesh on the bones yourselves. Define them however you see fit. So states go about that process in different ways. And so war crimes in Belgium are defined in a radically different way to war crimes in Canada and to war crimes in Australia through implementing legislation that applies nationally. Similarly, there's sort of an interesting overlay of laws in international bodies. And so when we come to crimes against humanity, for instance, we will see that the definition in the ICTY statute, the Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia, is different to the definition in the Rwanda statute, which is different again from the definition in the statute of the International Criminal Court. So there's all of these differences. And then what is fascinating is that countries, and we'll talk more about this down the road, but many countries aren't party to the statute of the International Criminal Court. So many countries like the United States and China and Pakistan and India haven't signed and endorsed the statute of the International Criminal Court. And so there's a push also to create a new treaty governing crimes against humanity because they have no basis in treaty law. And so you start to see this sort of web of interlacing and potentially inconsistent definitions of international criminal law, which undermines our sense that even the crimes that we reference when we adopt this definition, even these crimes are not uniform from one jurisdiction to the next. Gender crimes in particular are a good example of this and an important example because really up until the 1990s, there was such a really spectacular dearth of engagement with women's experience of war and atrocity to the point that rape wasn't even explicitly enumerated as one of the violations of the Geneva Conventions that would give rise to criminal responsibility. Initial attempts to prosecute rape in the 1990s as a war crime prosecuted as torture because there was no self-standing criminal offense. And there's interesting work that we can talk about and more, which attributes that really to the absence of any women in the negotiation of the treaties. We can come back to that momentarily. Again, I'm using this, all of that changed at the International Criminal Court, where there was a sort of an important infusion of a whole range of different atrocity crimes, especially under the rubric of crimes against humanity, that were far more sensitive than ever before to the experience of women during war. So again, the point here is just to insist international criminal law is not necessarily consistent from one forum to the next. They derive from different sources, and different states have different understandings based on what they have defined in their national legislation and what treaties they adopt, sign, and ratify for themselves. There's a very interesting problem also, which I want to introduce you to now. I've sort of gestured at it in different ways, but there's sometimes an important division of labor in defining the law between international law, and national law. And maybe the best way of illustrating this is the Van Anrat case. Because what happened in the Van Anrat case, you'll recall it was a case in national courts in the Netherlands, and it was a case that was based on Dutch legislation incorporating international crimes into Dutch criminal law. And again, you'll remember that Van Anrat is tried with traditional international crimes, like the ones that we see here. Van Anrat is tried with genocide and war crimes. But then the question arises, all right, so you've charged this guy as an accomplice in genocide and and war crimes. But where do you get the concept of complicity? What body of law does that come from? And here's the question. Do we derive it from international law? And if that's the case, which international law? Because the standard of complicity at the International Criminal Court is different from the standard of complicity at the Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunals. So if international, which international? And then secondly, well, why don't we just apply Dutch concepts of complicity in Dutch criminal law? Because after all, this is a national case applying national law. Why don't we apply our concept of complicity, which, take a deep breath, is different to both of the other alternatives already? And so this is true everywhere. Like if cases are brought in Australia or in Canada based on the International Crimes Acts in those countries, there are important questions about where things like procedure come from, where things like forms of responsibility and defenses come from. Are these defined explicitly in the Act? If they're not, can you draw on customary international law? Is it treaty obligations that you draw on? Often what you'll find is national courts draw on their own national law. The important point for you to come away from in thinking, though, what is international criminal law is it's quite amorphous. It's not a single unitary thing. It's quite diverse. It's relatively plural. The other, and I think final aspect that I wanted to emphasize for you is that what's interesting about international criminal law cases is that they're not necessarily international in the sense of transboundary. And there are a couple of reasons for this. The most obvious one is civil war. So civil war isn't really international in that important sense. And so there's a way in which even the word international in international criminal law is misleading. But there's a story that I think is pretty significant for your understanding about the origins of crimes against humanity that we'll pick up on when we discuss those crimes, that really highlights this. So at the end of the Second World War, which is a crucial moment in many respects for the development of the law that gives rise to the definition that I described, at this moment, there's sort of like a very entrenched, intense concept of sovereignty in international law. And that intense concept of sovereignty is, listen, international law is about the relationship between states. It's to states. So you have state A, which is a circle. You have state B, which is a circle. And international law is about the relationship between the two. What's crucial for your understanding is, what's essential for your understanding is that international law is only about that relationship. It's only about that relationship because the idea is, in international law, sovereignty is supreme. We have a very intense concept of sovereignty. And that concept means, don't tell me what to do within my state. That's our business. We're a sovereign country. International law has no role penetrating through the state to create responsibilities and obligations for individuals within a state. It's about state-to-state relations and only state-to-state relations. One of the spectacularly significant things that takes place at Nuremberg in particular, hard to overstate its significance, is that the court pretty much says in a single sentence or two, it's like, crimes aren't committed by abstract entities, they're committed by men. And we're going to hold individuals responsible. It's like, wow, that's breathtaking. You just totally restructured all of international law in a single sentence. Such was your outrage that you could do this and say, no, international criminal law can reach directly into states and find individuals within states to hold accountable. What a radical, radical idea that international criminal law can do this. Why? Why was it necessary for international criminal law to make this radical move? Well, for a lot of the crimes that took place, they could have been prosecuted using war crimes on this initial state-to-state view. There wasn't actually a need to do this massive shift of saying international law can reach into states and prosecute individuals. Because, say, like all of the atrocities that Germany committed in Poland or Czechoslovakia or Russia, they're all war crimes. Those were already all about state-to-state relations. But there was a problem, and the problem was the ways in which the German government had treated its own people. The problem was, can you really say, okay, so the ways in which people in Poland, for instance, were rounded up and put into concentration camps is criminalized, but like doing the same to people with disabilities, Jews, homosexuals, within Germany is just something we can't really have anything to say about because of your little sovereignty arguments earlier about states being sort of like international law only about being state-to-state relations and having no ability to sort of say anything about how states govern their own. And crimes against humanity develops as a way of limiting that proposition. Crimes against humanity develops as a way of saying, you know what? No, you can't do that to your own people. And international criminal law will have something to say about it when it reaches such an important threshold. So we'll come back to that and say more about that momentarily. I want to go back, though, to this final aspect of the shortcomings of the definition, which is functionally, if you wanted to define the field, then you'd include a whole series of other sorts of things that weren't tied necessarily to the labels genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggression. You might, for instance, want to include truth and reconciliation commissions that won't necessarily use those criminal law terms, but nonetheless, their focus overlaps in a very substantial way with the purposes that international criminal justice might assign itself. Likewise, local justice within sort of Rwanda or places like this, which is directly attempting to address the realities of mass violence in substantially overlapping ways to international criminal justice, maybe that should be our way of thinking about international criminal law. Maybe it should be subsumed within transitional justice, which is a term we can discuss more later. I hope what you've got from this discussion thus far is it's important for you to have an understanding of the working definition of international criminal law, and to understand that this really is the way that most people conceive of what constitutes international criminal law. But for all of these 5 reasons, its boundaries are a little amorphous. And so I think it's crucial that you come away with that understanding. We have 5 more minutes, and I want to talk to you about the Damashka piece a little bit more and tell you some brief stories about the purposes of international criminal law. And what I want you to understand is, again, that one of the things that makes the identity of international criminal law problematic, interesting, difficult, one of the things that makes being precise about what constitutes international criminal law is that we don't necessarily have a uniform, structured, agreed concept of what international criminal law is trying to do. And so I've put on the PowerPoint now a set of possibilities. And what I hope emerges for you in this set of possibilities is that there really is some substantial choice about what the function of these institutions should be. And the absence of sort of a defined role within these contexts gives to prosecutors a substantial degree of discretion, but it also creates a possibility that we might be talking past each other very frequently when we discuss and criticize international criminal justice. We might be talking past each other because we have some different supposition about what are these institutions supposed to be doing. Let me give you some examples. Retribution is one example, and after the First World War, if you read through the presentation I had, people were so intensely outraged. The degree of hatred was apparent. I mean, historians say that like French and Belgian witnesses in trials that took place for international crimes in Germany breathed hatred, that when they left the courtroom, German crowds spat at them as they went home. Retribution is a key component of international criminal justice, and it's often cited as such. The idea that the guilty should be held responsible for what they deserve. It's not necessarily revenge, because retribution attempts to be a proportionate response and attempts to be principled. Often people have very strong reactions against retribution, but there's a big philosophy defending it as a proposition, and in a way is the dominant justification for criminal law in most national systems presently. So retribution is really quite an interesting counterintuitive area. Deterrence. A quick story about deterrence. So after a set of really quite spectacular international crimes in Argentina, there are still important prosecutions taking place from people my generation, because they've really committed it was so outrageous. It was so destructive of the fiber of the emotional and lives of an entire generation of people whose parents were traumatized, that we have this obligation to bring prosecutions now, even if it's 30 years, 40 years later, so that this doesn't happen again. I mean, Pinochet dropped 20,000 people out of airplanes. They disappeared them from, you're sleeping with your partner at night, and then, people with unmarked military gear break into your house, steal your partner out of your bed, and you never see the person again because he or she has been dropped out of an airplane, and the body's never found. So there's a sense, well, maybe the function of international criminal justice is deterrence. People should think twice about pulling stunts like that again. Maybe it's expressive denunciation, and by that I mean we're never going to prosecute the full extent of rape in war. No one has that ambition because it's so widespread. But by at least prosecuting some spectacularly sadistic incidences of it, there is a way in which we are expressing a set of moral values to the world which are significant. And some would take this idea of expressive denunciation and sort of extrapolate it across the function of important institutions like the International Criminal Court and say, listen, you should prosecute some people for land grabbing because it is really a spectacularly disastrous practice for local populations. You should prosecute some people for using child soldiers because really, what an awful thing to do to a person. You should prosecute some companies for pillaging natural resources because that's a primary driver of atrocity and there's not much attention paid to it. You should choose all of these sorts of things that express moral condemnation. That should be your function. There's another set of ideas that international criminal law should be about rewriting history to break down denial, be it like denazifying Germany. The Milosevic trial at the ICTY was an attempt to sort of write this uber complex, multifaceted history of the breakdown of the former Yugoslavia in 4 different parts, and ultimately went on and on and on to such a point that Milosevic died before they got to the judgment, which was widely perceived as the wrong approach at the time and led to sort of a whole series of reactions in the inverse. But that's at least one argument that, listen, international criminal law needs to be getting the facts straight so that people can't deny it in the future, for future generations in particular. A very ambitious idea that international criminal law should be about reconciliation, about promoting a sense of interpersonal justice between previously warring factions. And the argument goes something like, by holding individuals accountable, you sort of break down the stereotypes that a Hutu or a Bosnian Serb was responsible for these types of atrocities, when actually it was that individual there who made those choices, not his or her ethnic group. That we can say more about, but strikes me as an exceptionally ambitious project, which is a little bit divorced from the lived psychic realities that most of us entertain. There's an amazingly complex relationship now between international institutions and as guarantors of peace processes, and complex debates about whether the International Criminal Court and other institutions should grant amnesties in a bid to sort of promote peace, or whether that really is just doing insufficient amount to deter these crimes in the future and to make sure that those who are responsible for Mengele-type sadism are held responsible. An amazingly interesting discussion. And there's also restorative ambitions of trying to bring victims into a place where they are centered and have some capacity to exercise agency over their lives and recover from what has been a spectacularly violent process. I think that's all I'm going to say for this particular lecture. I hope I've given you an overview of the things that I set out in the beginning, and that is how law is a key. International criminal law is defined in a way that's closely linked to a set of international crimes that are specifically defined, and then includes all national and international attempts to enforce those, but in a way that definition is made complicated by ways in which we might think differently about each of those, and also the fact that all of the purposes we might assign to international criminal law are not especially well defined, not prioritized one way or the other, and this gives us some real room for appreciation as we go through the remainder of the course. Thanks so much.